Why is protest, or why are protest and dissent necessary in modern democracies? Given that in modern democracies, and we're talking here about mature democracies, people generally speaking have a voice. True, they're not direct democracies, but that's probably for reasons of practicality. You can't simply ask large populations to vote on everything all the time. Okay? People have there's an information gap, so people don't have the necessary and relevant data in order to make the correct decisions that a representational democracy does. And there's a time factor, and sort of how it's done. There's already a problem with voter turnout, for example, so asking people to vote more often possibly isn't going to help with that. So why, in a modern democracy, given that we have a voice, do we still need protest? Thoughts?
To make a statement.
Make a statement. What kind of statement?
Mostly political statements, needs in terms of needs and what you need or what you want, and if it's the only way of getting it, you're going to protest.
Okay.
Or,
oh, come on, one at a time. Come here.
to show the government that your problem is relevant enough.
Okay.
Well, if politicians in charge ignore people, protest is actually their only chance to be heard.
Okay.
We see nowadays that politicians do not get seriously. They do not get serious about petitions. They just throw them away, and some requirements they just do not respect. So protest is kind of, you want to get the message through and pass it to the government or municipality.
The voice of the minority generally expects the protest because they're not going to be heard through normal democratic means.
Okay. Most of those, though, we should be able to deal with within a concept of a mature democracy. If politicians don't listen to us, we vote them out. That's how we hold our politicians to account. Okay? If the government isn't listening to us, there's a simple solution. Support the opposition, or support an opposition party. So there must be something fundamentally amiss with the way our democracies are structured that makes protest necessary. If governments won't listen to us, the opposition should. So what is the problem that's occurring? The problem that's occurring is that in most democracies, we end up, and this is true particularly of mature rather than nascent democracies, new democracies, we end up with a political class that is divorced from the reality of its people.
Yeah,
Okay? The structures within democracies are such that those members of the political elite are insulated from the problems which might be caused by their policies. When politicians pass bills in education, those very rarely affect their own children, because the bills only affect schools that are funded publicly by the state, and most politicians don't send their children to those types of schools. When they pass bills regarding the social provision of healthcare, most politicians are in no way affected by those because they have private health insurance. When they pass transport policy, they're not affected by it because they don't use trains and cars in the same way that everyday citizens do. This isn't true of all democracies, okay? There are exceptions that sort of test the rule. Finland is usually an exception because the Finns are very demanding that their politicians live and work like normal people. And you see examples of that in other countries. In the Netherlands, for example, the royal family live as a normal family. They don't live in the palaces where the tourists walk around. Very different from the British royal family. Okay? It's only in the last few years that the Queen in England has been made to pay tax on her multi-million-pound income that is given to her by the state. In the Netherlands, the Queen has paid tax for about the last 60 or 70 years. So certain countries are far more progressive and protective of not creating political elites. But once a political elite emerges and becomes a class within itself, and that is important, then the normal types of expressing dissent in a democracy fails. And those are things like petitions, where you might have direct government apparatus. If sufficient numbers of people sign a petition, it provokes a debate in the parliament. Or it might simply be the power of the ballot box, the traditional check and balance that we have. When that occurs, dissent becomes essential in order for the democracy still to function. Okay, I'm going to put it out there that a democracy without dissent is not a democracy. Because you never get 100% consensus in a democratic vote. And so the moment there appears to be such a broad consensus, you should be very, very wary of it. Okay? People will often claim that consensus exists, not to end the debate, but to stop the debate before it's even happened. We don't need to have this debate because everybody agrees that. Politicians use this type of language all the time. All right-thinking people believe that. Everybody who thinks in the correct way comes to this conclusion. It presupposes the end of the debate. So dissent is essential if democracies are to continue to flourish. What types of dissent, and where I put protest, I could equally have put dissent, okay? I don't necessarily mean physical protest, I mean types of dissent as well. What types of dissent exist outside the usual political mechanisms of petitioning Parliament, writing to your Member of Parliament, and casting a vote at the ballot box? How else can we register our dissent?
Civil disobedience.
Civil disobedience, that's possibly a couple of steps down the line. I'm thinking before that, this might be a sort of a sequential process. What can we try to do?
To go out to the streets and to walk. And to
Okay, you could have public demonstration.
And can it also be boycott?
You can boycott certain products, so economic activity, or withholding economic activity. What about something much more mundane, low level?
Letters to newspapers.
Yeah, that's a form of protest and dissent. Writing letters to newspapers, trying to get the issue onto the public agenda. Okay? That's the first stage in any successful dissent movement or protest movement, is making the public aware that the dissent exists, that another view, an alternative position, is allowed and is credible. Very often, people disagree with what is being done, but say nothing because they think they're the only person who disagrees. Okay? That's partly to do with the way we evolve as a species. Evolutionary biology teaches us that there is safety in numbers. As individuals, we're pretty bad at being animals. We're not as strong as our competitors, we're not as fast as our competitors, our prey gets away too easily. What we do have is lots of this. And when we work together, we can overcome those disadvantages and use our ability to communicate to create a vast competitive advantage. It's the only way primeval people were able to tackle woolly mammoths and things like that. Okay? Was by collectivization. Collective action, usually for human beings, is more successful. But the first way, or the first step to collectivization, is airing the issue. Now, 30, 40 years ago, the only way you could do that was by trying to get it into your newspaper or onto local television or something like that. Okay? What other ways do we have now of airing issues to try and engender support on a public level? Social networking. Can be incredibly important, but equally we must never overestimate the value of it. Blogging as well, anything to do with internet communication. The internet, like most other things, is a medium. Okay? It doesn't do things in and of itself. It doesn't do things necessarily differently. We choose what we put out there. Sometimes we can be a little bit blinded to the reality of just how useful social networking sites are. There was a perception in the Arab Spring that Twitter and Facebook were in some way crucial to the popular movements of protest that were occurring there. Probably just not true. Okay? Does anybody know the proportion, for example, of the Egyptian population that has regular internet access?
10%.
Maximum 10% of the population. And mostly concentrated in Cairo. Of those that have regular access, not all of them check it daily. And of those that do, not all of them are active on Facebook and on Twitter. We're probably talking about, in total terms of the population, between 0.5% and 1% of the Egyptian population active frequently on Twitter and Facebook. So don't make the mistake of thinking that the Arab Spring is in somehow a Twitter or a Facebook revolution. Okay? In a lot of countries where we're facing that kind of protest, the internet simply doesn't reach people in the same way as word of mouth or more mainstream media, where every cafe has a television tuned to a news channel and things like that. So we could blog about it, we can try to raise awareness on social networking sites. What else can we do? Can we lobby Parliament? Yeah. Well, that's what I'm asking. Can we do it? Who does lobby Parliament usually for change?
Organizations, corporate.
Organisations. What types of organisations? NGOs. NGOs lobby very often for change, but they are usually large established groups. To create a new one from scratch can be very, very difficult. And it might well be that the issue you want to protest doesn't fit neatly into one of those existing structures. Okay? So the question comes, how do we best start to spread the word? Might well be public demonstration, it might be leafleting, it might be direct action that is non-invasive, that is non-critical in terms of disrupting infrastructure, flash mobs, for example. There are all sorts of ways that you can try to get awareness for your message out. But getting the awareness out is absolutely crucial for the next step. Okay? So the next step in your protest is going to be generating what they call critical mass. Okay? Generating critical mass. What do we mean by the term critical mass?
Big amount of people.
Enough to impact.
Enough people.
Yeah. Getting to what some people would call the tipping point. Getting to the point at which it's very, very difficult to continue to ignore the protest going on. Okay? Anyone who knows anything about non-violent resistance movements knows that this is the crucial element. Achieving critical mass on the streets usually prevents governments from using force to crack down on protests, usually. Not in every case, but when the government does use force, it tends to lose some of its legitimacy. Certainly in the eyes of the public and in the eyes of the international community. Okay? Good examples of where critical mass has been achieved and has forced real change are the independence movements in India, the Velvet Revolution in the Czech Republic. I realise these didn't necessarily happen in democracies, but they are still important as a way for protesting and using as a model for protesting in democracies. Okay. So the Velvet Revolution in the Czech Republic, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine.
Argentina, they avoid a law being implemented by protesting in a, I don't know where, but they started protesting and the law was denied.
Yeah. So there are a number of historic examples that illustrate how important critical mass is. It is essential, whilst you are building up the protest, that you maintain legality at all times. Why?
It gives the government to cancel their protest.
It does give the government reason to cancel the protest, but individual criminal activity is not usually a reason to shut down the whole thing. Well, what does that give rise to, individual criminal activity?
Why anarchy?
No? Well, it might do, but we're hopeful that it won't. If key members can be removed at different stages of development because they've engaged in criminal activity, that brings the whole process back, okay? Because what all movements need are people that drive them forward, and some people do that more than others. So if a government becomes aware of a growing protest and of the likelihood of success, the first thing they will do, and still in democracies, is search for evidence of individual criminal activity to break up the coterie at the core, to break up the hardcore protesters, okay? To stop them from being active, from recruiting more members, because the government knows that critical mass is the key. So things like wiretapping and surveillance come into play. And don't believe that because you live in a lovely, fluffy democracy, that governments don't spy on their people, all right? We all now know that that's not the case. Snoop, yes. I mean, anybody who genuinely thought the governments weren't spying on us before was just a little bit naive. I mean, Snowden simply confirmed what a lot of us already suspected. But governments might have a legitimate reason for conducting that surveillance. We can't always assume that they don't, especially when we're caught in a wider net, okay? There are some types of movement that suffer from this blurring of the line of illegal and legal behaviour. Particularly the movement that we call hacktivism. Okay? Groups like Anonymous, who seek to further progressive liberal ends, particularly freedom rights, representation rights, minority rights, very often do so in a way that may well be counterproductive for the popular support of the movement.
Like Brazil? Now, like Brazil, it was the Brazilian people, but it was also because of Anonymous, so...
Yeah. Well, it's difficult to tell when it is and when it isn't anonymous, because anybody can put on the Guy Fawkes mask, right? Okay, I'm pretty sure that not everybody on the streets in Brazil, and at times there were 150,000 people out there, I'm pretty sure not all of them were from Anonymous.
Probably.
I'm quite sure also that Anonymous was quite happy for the masks to be used and give publicity to their cause as well. Okay? But that blurring of the lines, any blurring of the lines, remember the illegal activity does not need to be in pursuit of the goal of the protest in order to be used against the protest. Look at the way WikiLeaks has been viewed since the allegations against Julian Assange about sexual assault. It's got nothing to do with WikiLeaks. His personal morality about sex and things like that has nothing to do with the right or wrong of leaking the information which he believes we all have a right to know. But it is used to discredit the whole movement. So it is essential, as the movement grows, that key players within it, those people who are best able and most responsible for spreading the word, for recruiting, for increasing numbers, for organising small demonstrations which we hope will lead to larger ones, it is absolutely crucial that those people keep going down a legal path. Okay? It may well be that you get to a point where legal activity simply isn't enough anymore, where you have to move into areas of civil disobedience, which are technically law-breaking, but we aim, or that the aim would be to disrupt rather than destroy as much as possible, to cause problems for the government rather than to actually blow things up, endanger lives, and things like that. And one of the important things about democracy is that all democracies worth the name guarantee you certain rights which are essential to your ability to protest. Okay? So any move by government to limit those particular rights should be resisted as strongly as possible, because you never know when you might need them. Okay? So what rights specifically are we then talking about? Right of self-expression, or freedom of self-expression. And that means what? Free media enterprise, no interference from government in media. More basic than that? What's the most basic self-expression?
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech. Right. What else? Something you are all given by virtue of, or you will be near from midnight by virtue of your EU citizenship. Something you are all granted by the European Union. Freedom of movement. Okay? Governments do not have a right to restrict where you go, provided that you engage in lawful activity. Freedom of assembly. Okay? You choose who you associate with. Very often, governments will seek to restrict, particularly freedom of movement and freedom of assembly, when? When is the most common time to try and restrict those two rights?
When the protests are getting bigger.
Forget about protests, just more generally. When might governments seek to limit rights of movement and rights of assembly?
In case of war?
Yeah, in times of conflict. But even then, we should be very careful about what powers we allow the government, what freedoms we allow our governments to take away from us. Okay? Because we cannot be naive enough to believe that once the conflict is over, the powers come back. Right? Value-added tax, which exists in almost every country, was first introduced as a temporary measure to pay for a war. And it never, ever went away. Okay? When governments find that something brings in money, they're very reluctant to switch back just because they said it was temporary to begin with. So whenever governments try to restrict those rights, which are fundamental, they are not just part of your EU citizenship, they are enshrined in both the UN and the European Council's Charter on Human Rights, that's when we should start to be worried, and we should be ready to mobilise at that first instance. Unfortunately, we're a little bit complacent. Okay? One of the tools used to break up a lot of the Occupy movements in various cities around the world was that freedom of assembly was not absolute. Because the Occupy movements caused disruption to the legitimate activities of businesses, the police were allowed to go in and break up some of the camps by force. This happened in states across the USA, happened in Oakland particularly, happened on Wall Street to a degree, certainly happened with Occupy London. Okay? We probably should have been a little bit more angry than we were that the state was willing to resort to the use of force to break up peaceful protest movements. Okay, so looking then at types of protest, we've talked about the low level and how we mobilise and publicise. When we get to the point at which we think we have enough of public demonstration, what are the types of things we should try to do? What are the types of things that are likely to create the buzz which we want in order for the issue to be talked about? Well, things like Occupy worked very well because they had an impact not just on the districts where they were, which were usually financial districts, they had an impact on the day-to-day lives of most people. Okay? And that's important. You cannot have successful protest if you're worried about affecting everyday people. Because it's only by the effect being made direct upon them that most people will sit up and take notice of the issue anyway. Some of those people will be angry with you, and that's okay. They have a right to be angry. But hopefully, they will take the time to investigate, to talk to people, and discover what they really should be angry about. Okay? Too often, protests break down into a battle not between the state and the protest, but between the protesters and non-protesting citizens. And that's not a battle the protesters will ever win, because there will always be more of them than there are of us. Okay? So non-protesting citizens we should never seek to confront, we should seek to engage. Try to bring them over to our side, or at least to accept the legitimacy and the validity of the reasons for the protest in the first place. So reasons to protest. These might be important. What reasons are there in modern democracies to protest? Given that, again, in most modern democracies, there is significant provision of individual and human rights, there is significant protection of minorities. What sort of things is it legitimate and good for us to protest? Should we protest against progressive legislation, for example? If we feel strongly about marriage being a traditional institution between a man and a woman, is that something we should look to protest publicly about? How do we feel?
I think it's more like individual, whether people decide or not. So.
Well, I mean,
Hang on, she hasn't finished. Don't talk over the top.
So I think it's something like person basis. So we shouldn't maybe all protest because it's like the right of everybody to get married and they can choose maybe. So I don't think it's really reason.
In Croatia, one movement was popular in the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 months. One non-governmental organization was collecting, it was having petitions, and we are going to have a referendum about
collecting signatures.
Yeah.
Against that, and in my opinion, I think that, okay, besides my opinion about gay marriage,
Can we all use the term equal marriage?
equal
I prefer
marriage,
equal
yeah, equal marriage. I don't think that actually we have a say in, how to explain that. So they were actually in Croatia, they wanted to define the marriage in the law between a woman and a man, so it could actually be defined. And I don't think that that should be, or that they have a right to say in that, because the law doesn't affect them.
But what I think that the problem is not the thing they were fighting for. The problem is that the government said that this referendum that will the public will start won't be legitimate, and that's wrong because in the document that defines laws in Croatia, yeah, in the bill, it says that every referendum that the public wants has to be legitimate. So that's the problem.
Yeah. Well, I believe that if majority of people want something or feel something, and the government is doing something else, then protest is always legitimate, no matter the team.
Okay. On a basic level, you're right. Everybody has a right to protest, to mark and register their dissent. The question becomes, how far is it legitimate to go in seeking for your protest to be successful?
How much right do we have? Okay, yeah, again, we have a right to protest, but why is the reason to change the law if the law is not affecting you?
That's the point I'm going to come to.
Well,
I would argue that it is not legitimate to pursue protest to its final conclusion in the interest of denying other people rights. Claiming your own rights, go as far as you want. Okay? Go as far as you want to claim your own rights. Register your dissent to deny other people that you don't think it right should be extended to other people, but I think there is a limit to how legitimate that protest is. Because eventually, and this is almost always true, you will find yourself on the wrong side of history. Okay? And that is not something we should compel states to be. So, in terms of the international community, when we look at those protests, we should have more regard for the protests that seek to further rights rather than those that seek to limit them. Okay? Does everybody understand why that difference in sort of philosophical legitimacy of the protest exists? Because it's one thing for me to say I don't think person X deserves this right, but how far I'm willing to go to deny them that right usually means I will deny them other rights as well as part of the protest. And that's never legitimate, because those rights exist. And when states don't allow for the progression of rights, the states themselves get left behind. Okay? There were states in the US, individual states, that voted against the abolition of slavery. They found themselves on the wrong side of history. It's still a thorny issue in some places, but there is no person or politician who is going to stand up and say, I want to reintroduce slavery in Alabama. Okay? Because they recognise, not that there isn't the popular support for it, there probably is in Alabama, unfortunately, but what they do recognise is the lack of legitimacy in furthering that dissent and that protest. The dissent can exist, but protest manifestation is not as legitimate in some circumstances as in others. And it's not a question of whether I agree with it or not. There are some issues where I might be more conservative, and I still think this is the bright line. You don't protest to the full extent to limit the extension of rights. Reasons to protest in a more practical sense, the ones we've seen recently, have usually centred around things like cuts in government spending, the economic crisis, and things like that. Problem with those protests, problem with the Occupy movement. Very often, the people protesting are protesting cuts in general or some cuts specifically. They might not all be protesting the same cuts. There is a lack of cohesion. There is a lack of unity within the protest movement, which makes it easier for attacks on it to be successful, as people are splintered off and that critical mass starts to fall apart. Okay? What the Occupy movement lacked was any clear, concrete proposals of its own. They were anti lots of things, but we didn't know what they were pro. Okay? Contrast that with movements like the Velvet Revolution in the Czech Republic, and it was pretty obvious what that movement wanted. And everybody was united behind it. Sure, there were differences of opinion within the Velvet Revolution as to how the new country would be formed, structured, and things like that. Those differences of opinion should always exist and in fact are healthy. But when there is an absolute lack of purpose, of singularity of purpose, of unity, usually the protest is doomed to fail. Okay? Because the people we often fight most when we're in that protesting mood are the people who are a little bit like us but not quite the same. Because they're the ones where we think, if you just came an inch this way, then you'd be on my side. And that really frustrates us. It's human nature, to a degree. What other reasons might there be to protest? What other recent protests have we seen?
Anti-corruption.
Yes.
Basic rights in what sense?
Education.
Education?
Or the right to minimum wage of salary or basic necessities.
Yeah. Basic necessities. The living wage protest is an ongoing one. Okay? There are several proposals about. It might be a good idea if we could all come together and agree on what we mean by the term living wage. Most economists agree that a living wage is somewhere around 70% of the median, the average wage within a country. That's usually a lot more than that which is defined by minimum wage legislation. Okay? Minimum wage legislation very often is the minimum wage. And since it's been introduced, the minimum wage has not kept pace with average wages. Okay? When minimum wage was introduced in the USA in the 1950s, had it kept pace and been increased proportionally alongside the average income of the country, the minimum wage in America would now be somewhere around $25 an hour, which would be quite a decent wage, and certainly a livable wage. And that would be the minimum had it kept pace. As it is, the minimum wage in America, depending on the state, is somewhere between $9 and $12. Half what it should be had the increase been proportional with just the average wage of the country. I assume you all know that the wages of the people at the very top have increased far further than even the average. So over time, we're seeing a widening gap between those at the top and those at the bottom. The idea that you can somehow work your way from one position to the other within a free market system is becoming less and less real for many, many people. Because the class, the economic class they are born into, usually is the economic class they will stay in until they die. There is very, very little progression in an economic sense in most mature democracies today. Okay? There is less economic and social progression in the US than there ever has been. When we measure the class into which people are born and the class in which they die, and how much movement there is in their lifetime, there is less than there has ever been. So clearly we have a problem. But again, because of a lack of unity, a lack of cohesion, lack of singularity of purpose, the protests which we could be focusing in that area aren't gaining the publicity, aren't gaining the critical mass that they possibly need. There are some very popular reasons to protest which perhaps are always doomed to failure. Okay? That doesn't mean they are less legitimate. It does mean that people going into them should be aware of the likelihood of failure being far greater than the likelihood of success. One of those, and it's a perennial protest movement, is the Stop the War movement. Wherever the war is, there's usually a Stop the War movement. Okay? For the last 12 years, it's been focused around Iraq and Afghanistan, because those are the countries where the mature democracies are fighting their wars. Popular protest very, very rarely is going to affect foreign policy in a military sense. There's a reason why we don't have national referenda on whether to enter wars in the first place. Okay? Because the average citizen's ability to cope with the idea of prosecuting a war is vastly reduced compared to legislators, people who have to take those decisions and take that responsibility. One of the things that cripples a country's ability to prosecute war effectively is the sight of bodies coming home. This was true of the greatest military power the world has ever seen in America, when they started to see body bags coming home from Vietnam, and they were actually shown on the news. The peace movement, the hippie movement in the 1960s grew exponentially. Not because everybody suddenly became a hippie, but because even straight-laced, short-haired working people now saw what the hippies had been saying in terms of stop the war. The moment it touches me as an individual, and a war in Iraq can only touch me as an individual when somebody I know goes to fight in it and comes home dead. Okay? So stop the war movements very, very often, whilst entirely legitimate, and I don't deny anybody's right to protest on the basis of pacifism, almost always will not succeed, and possibly a good thing that they don't. Because it would hamper countries' abilities to prosecute just war effectively. And some wars possibly do need to be fought. Not all of them. I'm certainly not a gun-toting, you know, let's go in wherever we see a problem and sort it out with weapons. But I think some wars possibly need to be fought. Well, certainly the international community needs to be ready to back up its stance with force if necessary. There are mechanisms for just war. They are essentially contained in one of the great works of philosophical literature, De Jure Belli ac Pacis, On the Laws of War and Peace, by a Dutch philosopher, Hugo de Groot, better known as Grotius, writing in about 1625. Okay? And everything he said about the concept of the nation-state and when nations have a right to defend themselves still holds true in conflict law. But for our purposes, there are only two legal mechanisms for war. One is the UN Charter, which defines when a country can engage in war as an act of self-defense, or when called upon to do so by a Security Council resolution. And the other is the NATO Charter, of which most of our nations are members, because, again, by virtue of being in the EU, we're all members of NATO. I think Croatia is also a member of NATO anyway, aren't we?
From 2005.
Yeah. So we have the NATO, we have Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which explicitly states an attack on one member is an attack on all. That was our legal justification for the war in Afghanistan. And we have Article 42 of the UN Treaty. So if ever you come to debate about sort of peace movements and stop the war protests, always be clear that there are legal mechanisms for war, and that those are the two principal ones for mature democracies. Article 42 of the UN Charter, Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. So, broadly then, our reasons to protest might be illegitimate action of government, in which case we should always protest, particularly where that action seeks to limit our ability to protest in the first place, limiting rights of freedom of expression, assembly rights, and so on. Where the situation that was imagined when policy was passed 30, 40 years ago has not been maintained. For example, minimum wage not keeping pace with median wages in countries, to the extent that the minimum wage is now often worth half of what it was before. Peace movements are always a legitimate reason for protest, but very often won't be successful. And then we have those individual questions of morality, where the legitimacy lies in whether you are extending or attempting to restrict provision of rights. One is always going to have more moral legitimacy than the other. Okay. How protest actually occurs. How do flash mobs happen? Has anybody ever taken part in a flash mob? Does everybody know what I mean by a flash mob? Yeah? What do I mean?
I think a protesting arms or something.
Yeah, lots of people suddenly descending on a place and doing a piece of theatre, dance, something like that. Usually to bring attention to one specific thing. And that will usually be at the place where the flash mob occurs. If a company, for example, is engaged in what we consider to be reprehensible or illegitimate activity, because they use sweatshops abroad, or They don't enforce safety regulations in factories in Indonesia, which then collapse and burn and people die. Those sorts of things are often best targeted through flash mobs. Okay? Raising awareness. The other type of protest that is good for that, and that is often very effective, is public campaigns of boycotting products. Okay? Some of the most effective recent protest campaigns have been online against online institutions. Okay? There was one recently against Facebook, because it was held, there was a poster, I can't remember the exact details, but it was a poster which glorified violence against women, and when people complained about it, Facebook issued their stop response of "this does not violate Facebook's policy on images which are likely to incite hatred, violence, or criminal activity." And it was a poster which made a joke about rape. Now, if you don't think that rape is a hateful activity or is likely to incite, joking about it is likely to incite potentially criminal behaviour, then there's probably a problem there. But the campaign went viral within seconds. Thousands and thousands of Twitter users were publicising on other websites what Facebook's stance on this particular poster was. Within minutes, Facebook had changed its position. So the type of protest, or how the protest occurs, very often needs to be tailored both to the people against whom you're protesting and to the nature of the activity that you're protesting. Okay? If the transgression is online, then online protest tends to work best. Where the case is more serious, where the case requires government action, then the best way of doing it is through public demonstration, because it's the most immediately visible, most immediately audible, and presents the most problem for the government if they don't deal with it. Okay? Governments can't simply choose to crack down with violence if they want to maintain any form of legitimacy. Okay? Government in Syria has chosen to crack down on protests with violence, and we've seen the response, again, lack of actual response, but we've seen the spoken response of the international community. Hopefully it will lead to some more concrete action. But when countries like China crush student protest quite literally with tanks in Tiananmen Square, the response of the international community immediately after the event was condemnation. Hasn't led to any change though with China. Because in China we have a country that we cannot afford to do without. We cannot afford not to do business with China. And so sometimes the morality of the government takes a backseat to the practical concerns. Okay? Europe needs Chinese products that are cheap in order for us to keep buying them. Because of the economic crisis, we don't have the money to buy more expensive goods. Okay? Mass movements in China tend not to happen. It's very, very hard to mobilise 1 billion people and get them all thinking in the same way, unless you have significant control over media and the exposition of information. And only one entity in China can do that, the government. Right. However, what we are seeing in China is we are starting to see more individual demand, and this is another way in which protest occurs, individual demand for more liberalisation. Okay? And that is coming not from a groundswell of popular movement, but from well-placed private individuals who have benefited from the economic reforms of Deng Xiaoping, introduced in 1979, when he first became the premier, and now see, as most people do when they gain more wealth, that with their leisure time they also want more participation in the state. Okay? So it doesn't have to be the case that protest is collective. It's usually more effective when the action is collectivized. But it certainly doesn't have to be the case that it is collective. There can be significant figures from popular culture, from sport, from media, media, or privately wealthy individuals who themselves can mount protest and lead to demands for change. Okay? One such figure currently is the former captain of the Pakistan cricket team, Imran Khan, who has done an awful, now I'm in no way suggesting that Pakistan should be classified as a mature democracy, but it is a democracy. It is a democracy riddled with problems, though. Riddled with allegations of corruption, of nepotism, which is always a problem in nascent democracies anyway, the idea of a political dynasty in the Bhutto family. It happens in India to a degree with the Gandhi family still being seen as somehow a dynastic line of succession. But Imran Khan, as a popular figure that transcended the usual divisions that exist within Pakistan between ethnicities, tribes, or ancient tribes, people who had regional power before the country became united, he was able to transcend those boundaries and stand on a platform not just for his political view, or a left-wing or a right-wing stance, but from the point of view of removing these problems within Pakistan's democracy, and gain wide political support for that. Figures like Imran Khan exist in other countries. Okay? Very, very influential figures usually tend to have means behind them. That's one thing that they can have, which groundswell of popular movements often struggle with. It's all very well for lots of people with no money to get together to protest, but if you need funds to keep the protest going, then you need to gain those funds from somewhere. Another person who we might consider mounting a protest on an individual level and trying to change behaviour through that is Bill Gates with the Gates Foundation. Okay? He has taken deliberate steps to say, people in my position, people with my influence and my wealth, should not be looking to create more businesses and more wealth. We should be looking to reverse that process. Okay? The Gates Foundation does some amazing work in some parts of the world. However, as always, there are questions about the efficiency with which they implement the programs and whether those programs are being implemented in the right places. Because with everything, whenever protest occurs, government has two options. It can ignore it, or it can engage. And if it engages, what it will often try to do is give enough to the protest movement to quieten it without actually really changing anything. Okay? A sort of drip feed effect. That you keep people just above the line at which the protest becomes more serious, at which it crosses from non-violent protest into more violent and more direct action. Okay, before we go on to the final section, the chances of success, I want to talk a little bit about that tipping point between violent and non-violent action. When, if ever, does it become legitimate in a mature democracy for the protesters to deliberately break laws in order to further their ends? First, it depends what laws they are breaking. Okay? Civil disobedience is usually accepted as a legitimate form of protest because the disruption is minimal, it's usually targeted, or at least if it's widespread, it's low level enough not to become a real problem for individuals but wakes them up to the issue. Examples of good civil disobedience in times of war: refusing to be conscripted into the army, the burning of the draft card by students protesting the Vietnam War in the United States. Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher, was sent to jail during World War II because he refused to fight. Okay? Anything where the action is harmful to oneself is always going to have legitimacy. Because if somebody is willing to make that sacrifice, it usually means that the protest is worth sacrificing things for. Hunger strikes are also a good way of doing it. And one of the best examples, Gandhi. Okay? The image most people have of Gandhi in their mind is probably the one taken from the film, where he's not actually Gandhi, it's Ben Kingsley, but old, bald, little round glasses with a loincloth and very, very thin. Okay, that's the classic image we have of Gandhi, because that is the image that encapsulates the man and his movement, the peacefulness of the protest, the ongoing nature of the struggle, the self-sacrifice that he was willing to endure. It's very, very difficult to find somebody who doesn't believe that Gandhi was a force for good. Okay? When protests do become more violent, we should be very careful that that violence is again directed at individuals or institutions who are able to withstand it, first and foremost, and who, either through inaction of their own or through explicit action of their own, have caused, at least in part, the problem against which we are protesting. Okay? This is where the boundary exists between legitimate, potentially violent action and acts of terrorism. Okay? If, let's use Northern Ireland as an example, if the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, had confined themselves to only attacking installations of the British Army, they might have had a lot more legitimacy than they did blowing up buses full of school children. School children are not able to withstand violence. They are also in no way responsible for the situation. Okay? There was a dispute for a long time in the 1980s about whether Nelson Mandela should be considered a purely political prisoner or not. Amnesty never recognised Nelson Mandela as a political prisoner. Okay? It's important to remember that. Because the ANC engaged in direct violent action against the state. And for amnesty, one of the keys is that you must never, if you are imprisoned for committing a crime, amnesty does not consider you a prisoner of conscience. And one of the things of which Nelson Mandela was accused was a bombing which injured or killed some school children near Soweto. Okay? Now it might well be, as may well have been the case with the Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland in the 1980s, that the children were not the intended target. It might well be that it was an army patrol van or something like that, and the bomb went off at the wrong time. Most people don't care. If you're willing to take that risk, you must also be willing to take the consequences. And one of the consequences is your movement loses legitimacy. And when it loses legitimacy, the state's legitimacy in cracking down on your movement increases in parallel. So they are relational. Okay? As one goes up, the other goes down. As the movement loses legitimacy, the state's right to use force to end the movement increases. And one of the things that characterises the state as an entity, according to Weber, is the monopoly of the legitimate use of force. Okay? It is important to recognise that the state, on some level, must, if it is in the interests of the majority of the citizens within that state, have the right to end the protest. It should seek to do so by the most peaceful means possible, using the minimum amount of force necessary. Whether that includes things like tear gas and water cannons is something to be debated, to be decided. I'm not here to tell you how states can crack down on protests. But it is important to recognise whenever protests become more extreme, they must be very, very careful about the way in which, particularly that extreme action, usually violent action, is directed. Destruction of property is always going to be better than threatening lives of individuals because we can rebuild it. When damage is reversible, it is lessened to a degree. Buildings are better able to withstand the shocks of attack than are people. Equally, we shouldn't accept it when protesters are punished for damaging property in a way that suggests they've done something worse. We can rebuild windows in shops that have been smashed. We don't necessarily need to send those protesters to prison. That might be counterproductive both for the state and for the individual. It might make that individual more hardened against the state, more likely to engage in violent protest in the future, because they now see the state as an entirely illegitimate actor. Okay? Defacing war memoria and things like that might be something that upsets a lot of people, but it's not permanent. We can clean it up. And so we as individuals, if we don't agree with the protest, should never make the mistake of assuming that because we disagree with the protest, any action to shut it down is okay. We must always be on guard of when we might want to protest and what methods might be used against us. Okay? Protest in this context affects everybody. Whether we agree with that individual protest, we must recognise that one day it might be our turn. And we want those same tools available to us, and so we must be ready to defend people's right to protest even when we disagree with it. We must be ready to criticise states that crack down too severely on protests, because we never know when they might want to crack down on us. We cannot predict when we will be next, and for that reason alone, everybody's protest is our protest. Okay? Okay, we're going to finish up then by looking at the chances of success. What are the chances of success of individual protest movements? Historically, not good. Far more protest movements fail than ever succeed. I maintain that is not because protest is ineffective or pointless or bad for society. I maintain that the majority of protests fail because protesters don't necessarily know what they want at the outset, so cannot set clearly defined goals, so have no metric of success for themselves. The protests are often disjointed, that disaffected youths particularly are willing to join protest movements without ever really knowing what the protest is about, which leads to fractures within the protest movement. Again, that lack of cohesion, that lack of singularity of purpose that I've mentioned. Protests fail because energy fails. The state is immense and is often able to withstand protest for longer than we expect. Like in the old days of siege warfare, if you're going to protest successfully, you have to be willing to stick it out for the long haul. Okay? We need to be able to keep people coming into the movement. There is no point at which things like publicity, recruitment, or anything can ever stop. If the protest is ongoing, the influx of people needs to be ongoing because people will naturally drift out. So you need to refresh in that sense. You need to be clear about the types of protests that are legitimate for you, about what it is you're protesting against, and therefore what methods you can use to better further your cause. Okay? Having a regard to all of those things vastly increases the chances of success. Resilience is very often the most important. Okay? Time helps. People become more willing to accept progression and liberalisation of rights in successive generations. When homosexuality was first legalised in the United Kingdom in 1967, the majority of people were against it. Now it's almost impossible to reverse that law. There certainly wouldn't be popular support for it. Okay? So time, if you have it, is on your side. Funding might be an issue, but there may well be an opportunity to bring your protest to the attention of a particular individual within the media, within your society, who can garner that funding and that publicity. Okay? Even Julian Assange, who relied on his celebrity friends to arrange his asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy. So we all need to recognise that whilst we might think keeping the protest real, in inverted commas, is important, and if it's a protest of the people, it should be real people, working people who get involved, we can't dismiss the importance of figureheads for the movement in garnering further publicity, sustaining the lifeblood and the oxygen of the movement. Okay? If you go into a protest assuming you will succeed, you probably won't because you'll make mistakes. But you shouldn't be put off from protesting because you think you're going to fail. Some of the best protests weren't successful to begin with. But it was their very failure that gave rise to the next level of protests. Okay? Who here knows the story of the 300? The Battle of Thermopylae in ancient Greece, where 300 Spartan men stood strong against an army of 10,000 Persians. And they were massacred, unsurprisingly, because there was only 300 of them. They were all slaughtered. But they held out for an incredibly long time. And in their heroic failure, news spread that these 300 had held that narrow passage they'd chosen strategically for an incredibly long time. And so the next time the Persian army came, the Spartans were ready and willing to fight for their fallen brothers. Protest movements don't need to have immediate success. Sometimes we have to accept the necessity of initial failure in order to be able to build upon it. The suffragette movement, which argued for rights for women, wasn't successful. Most people know the story of Emmeline Pankhurst. Okay? Threw herself under the king's horse at the Derby in the 1920s and was trampled to death by it. It didn't overnight cause a change. Oh, sorry, 1913, it's just been the 100th anniversary. Didn't overnight cause a change. The change was essentially precipitated by World War I, when many women for the first time went into the workplace, and it became almost undeniable that people who work in munitions factories to help the war effort probably deserve a vote at the end of it. But the seed was sown in the heroic failures of the early suffragette movement, the steps they were willing to take, the self-sacrifices they were willing to make, the martyrdom, in effect, that they were willing to create, so that others had a reason to go on with the fight. Okay? Protest is essential if democracies are to remain healthy. Protest is an essential tool of self-expression. It is one that governments will always seek to resist, and one which we must never allow them to shut down before it's happened. Remember what I said at the beginning. Consensus in a democracy is very often the problem and not the solution. Because the consensus aims to shut down the debate before it's even started. As debaters, that is something you should be ready to protest against. Any questions? There you go. That's it. That's all I'm going to say. Protest. It's good. Do it. If anybody wants to read more on this topic, there's an excellent book. And this talks about it specifically in a US context and specifically in the context of the war on terror. But you can extrapolate from those two how it fits into the wider context. The book is called The Gag Rule. The subtitle is The Nature and Importance of Dissent in Democracy. And it's by a guy called Louis Leipheimer. Louis Leipheimer was a significant journalist in the US throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And what he identified was a rather worrying trend This is where the idea of consensus being damaging comes in. And that was whenever an American voice in the media tried to question the orthodoxy of the view that the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan were both inevitable, right, and would be successful, the response from government, from conservative media was, you're on the side of the terrorists. What did George Bush say about the Iraq War? What was his quotation when he was trying to drum up support in the international community?
About the 9/11.
No, he said it's almost a soundbite phrase. He said, countries have two options. They are either with us or they are against us. False binary. Okay? You've learned all about that in your argumentation fallacies. It's a false binary, but it's a very, very effective one. If you can implant as a government the seed in people's minds that any dissent is support for your enemy, then you can neuter protest very, very effectively. That's something to watch out for. Okay? When you're presented with that, you're either with us or against us. This is the only option. What else would you have us do? That kind of rhetoric should set the alarm bells ringing. All right? Because if it doesn't, then it makes legitimate protest almost impossible. There you go.